Hey guys, welcome back to biology. We are finishing our unit on DNA. So today we're going to talk about viruses and bacteria, which both have DNA, but behave much differently and are different types of organisms. I have open what you need to be successful in today's class. So you're going to start by opening this video, if you haven't already. Then you guys will open up your guided notes. I suggest split screening between the two. There's a place for you to answer your catalyst in here. And then as we go through the notes, you'll just fill in the blanks here, or you can fill them out on a separate sheet and upload that picture to this post. At some point in the slides towards the beginning, there's a link to a YouTube video. I'm going to link that for you to watch. It just talks about the differences between bacteria and viruses. So when I tell you to go watch it, pause this video, go watch that one and come back, and you'll have a better understanding of what it is we're talking about. And then your final assignment for today is your exit ticket. So your classwork grade for today is going to be your notes. Your exit ticket will be your assessment grade. And remember, those are the two new categories in our grade books at KNDLA. So let's go ahead and get into the work. So we're going to start with a catalyst. I'm sure you guys have missed those. Right here, we have an image, and this image shows an area with no surrounding membrane right here in the center of the cell. The area has one large DNA molecule right there. And we want to know if scientists would classify this as a prokaryote or a eukaryote. This is kind of a throwback to our second and third unit. And what you think parts A, B, and C are, and give your reasoning for that. So go ahead and pause the video and then come back once you've answered those questions. All right, so hopefully you've answered your catalyst. If we're looking at this organism right here, we're going to classify it as a prokaryote. Remember, we talked about this before. The prefix pro means before. This root kary in Greek means egg, so it's before the egg or before the nucleus. A eukaryote is a good egg or a good nucleus. So this is a prokaryotic organism, specifically a bacterium, that does not have a nucleus, so it's before the egg formed. Part A right here, we know is a strand of DNA. And then we have parts B and C. B is on the outside, C is on the inside. So if we're talking about the protective coverings on a cell, then C is going to be the cell membrane, while B is the cell wall. So here's our agenda for today. We have our catalyst, we're doing our guided notes, and then you have your exit ticket. It's a pretty simple class day. By the end of today's class, you guys should be able to tell me the characteristics of a virus, describe the characteristics of bacteria as well, and then differentiate between the two and identify organisms within each specific category. So here's that summary video I was talking about. It's kind of a preview of everything we're going to cover today. So go ahead and pause this video, go click that link and watch it, and come back once you've watched. All right, so now that you've gotten your preview, let's get into the actual notes. So today we're talking about viruses and bacteria. We're going to start by discussing what a virus is. And I'm going to put myself over these pictures. Sorry. So a virus is a disease-causing agent that contains protein and a genetic material, so either DNA or RNA. There's been a lot of discussion and debate in the scientific community about whether viruses are alive or not. But viruses are not alive because they can't reproduce on their own. And we talked about this when we talked about characteristics of life in Unit 2. Viruses also can't grow, so they don't get bigger, and they can't maintain homeostasis, which we also talked about in Unit 2. Remember, that's that state of internal balance in an organism. Viruses have a couple of key parts. The first is the protein, which forms a capsule or capsid around the genetic material. So these are the three types of viruses. You have a bacteriophage, animal virus, and a retrovirus. You can see on each of them, there's a covering around the DNA. That covering is your capsid, which is the protein. And then they also have either DNA or RNA, and sometimes both. So again, they come in 3 different shapes, but all of them have the same key parts: a capsid and genetic material. Here are some examples of diseases caused by viruses. So if you've ever had the common cold, then you have had a virus in your body. The flu is caused by a virus, coronavirus, obviously, hepatitis, herpes, AIDS, measles, chickenpox, encephalitis, which is a brain inflammation, rabies, and cancer are all caused by different types of viruses. Now, in order for viruses to reproduce, they can't do it on their own, so they actually have to use a host cell. So the host cell is pictured over here as this purple blob. The virus we're looking at is a bacteriophage, so we can assume the purple blob is a bacteria. And what happens is the virus attaches itself to the cell through a process called adsorption. So you can see it's attached here. And then it injects its RNA or DNA during the entry phase. So you can see the DNA that was inside of this bacteriophage has been injected into the cell. Then what happens is the cell starts to make and replicate the virus for itself. The virus tricks the body or the cell into thinking that it is a part of the cell. So the cell copies the RNA or DNA from the virus and then starts to build all of the components necessary to make new viruses. Once those new viruses have been assembled, they break out of the cell and then look for other cells to infect. So this final stage, the release stage, generally results in the death of the cell, and then you have thousands or even millions of viruses exiting one single cell to go infect more cells. So now we have to talk about how viruses are killed. At present, the only cure for a virus is known as a vaccine. So we don't have a way to kill a virus once it's in a body, but we do have a way to prevent it from infecting you in the first place. So vaccines are made from weakened or inactive viruses. In general, they grow these in eggs or some other protein medium, and then they inject them by needle into the host body. So when you get a vaccine, what you're doing is you're putting a weakened form of the virus in your body. Usually the capsule has been disrupted, so the DNA is just free floating. And this causes your body to build up antibodies, which are how our body fights off infection. So if the virus ever gets into your body again, you aren't susceptible to that disorder and won't get sick because you already have antibodies built up and you can recognize that virus immediately and start combating it, instead of taking those steps to actually build and produce antibodies upon initial infection. So here's some viruses that do have vaccines. Chickenpox, measles, flu, hepatitis, and rabies all have vaccines. If you haven't been vaccinated, you should probably go get those. It's one way to make sure that you are safe from different viruses. The other best way to fight viruses is by washing your hands often and doing it well, which you guys have probably seen all over Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, whatever, different tutorials on how to do this, but make sure that you are washing your hands frequently, especially during the pandemic. So we're going to talk about a few specific types of viruses. The first is the influenza virus. This one's super contagious, though not as contagious as COVID-19. And it's what causes the common flu. So symptoms include fever, muscle pains, fatigue, which is like a fancy word for being consistently tired, and coughs. And it can be transmitted through the air or through bodily fluids. We do have vaccines for the flu. We have to develop new ones every year based on the different strains that are available. So you should be getting your flu vaccine regularly because those viruses change or evolve every year. Next up, we have the Ebola virus, which I'm sure you all have seen in the news. Ebola is often fatal, so people who contract it usually die from the disorder. Symptoms include a high fever and uncontrolled bleeding. Oh, sorry that the slides are like this, but it's transmitted by your bodily fluids. So it can be transmitted through saliva, urine, sweat, blood. Ebola was initially found in Africa, though there have been cases in other countries. And currently, we do not have a vaccine or a cure for Ebola. Next up, we have HIV. So HIV is a retrovirus. You can see it over here in the shape. And it leads to a disorder called AIDS. What happens is HIV attacks your immune system specifically. So it attacks your immune cells and weakens your immune system over time. And HIV is transmitted by bodily fluids as well. So this is a sexually transmitted disease. It's killed more than 25 million people. And at present, we do not have a vaccine or a cure. Though we do have preventative pills called pre-exposure prophylaxis or PrEP that if you take daily can keep you from contracting the virus from someone who has been infected. And then we have the herpes virus. So this is another sexually transmitted disease. It causes blisters on the mouth or genitals. There are two types, type 1 and 2, and it's transmitted by direct contact with a place where someone has been infected with the virus. So either the mouth or genitals of another person. They cause what we call cold sores or also fever blisters. All right, so now let's move into the basics of bacteria. Bacteria are prokaryotic. Remember, that means that they do not have a nucleus. It's before the egg. They are unicellular, so they're made up of one single cell. They're single-celled organisms. They're microscopic, meaning they're super tiny. You can't see them with the human eye. And they go through a process of asexual reproduction called binary fission. So they don't require other bacteria to reproduce. They just split on their own and can do bad all by themselves. Bacteria are heterotrophic, meaning that they get the material they need to survive from other places. And they can also be chemoautotrophic. This prefix auto means self, chemo means chemical. So some bacteria can produce all the things that they need on their own through chemical processes. They break down decaying matter, so they can also be decomposers. And they multiply really quickly. So if you Google like bacteria replication video, you can watch how that process happens. But you can go from 1 to thousands and then millions in a very short time frame. In fact, one bacterial cell can replicate into over 1 million in just 12 hours, given the right conditions. Bacteria are found pretty much everywhere on Earth, so they are one of the most versatile organisms in existence. Not all of them are harmful. We have bacteria in our gut called your gut flora that help you with digestion of food. And we can't actually live without the bacteria that are in our body. So there's 600 types of bacteria found on your skin alone, and all of these are either not harmful or are helpful. Your saliva has 6 different types of bacteria, which also helps with the process of breaking down food. So again, don't always think of bacteria as a negative thing, but some of them can be pathogenic or cause disease. So for bacteria, this is what one looks like. These are all the different bells and whistles they can have, but there are a couple parts that are key on every bacteria. So again, they don't have a nucleus and they don't have organelles aside from ribosomes, which are these little dots here that produce proteins. So the DNA is free floating, and then there are no organelles besides the ribosomes. They do have a plasma membrane or a cell membrane, a cytoplasm, which is the gel in here that things float in a cell. They have DNA, which contains their genetic information. We've learned all about this unit. And then a cell wall for added protection. Some of them also have pili, or cilia, depending on the type, and flagella. Both of these are used for movement. A pilus, or pili, because there's more than one, are a bunch of little hairs that help them to navigate, or flagellum, which is kind of like a tail that whips back and forth to help them move around. So there are 3 shapes for bacteria. There are coci, which are these little round balls, spirilla, which look like spirals, so that's how you can remember that one, and then bacilli, which are rod-shaped. That's these guys right here. So again, the bacilli are rod-shaped bacteria. E. coli is one example of that, which is found in our bodies. The coci right here are spherical or rounded. One example of that would be streptococcus, which causes strep throat. And then you have spirilla, which are spiral shaped. An example would be treponema, which is the bacteria that causes syphilis. So now let's talk about how bacteria are killed. And it's actually, the outlook's much better for bacteria in general. So bacteria are killed by substances called antibiotics. Remember, for viruses, we have to have a specific vaccine. But for bacteria, we can actually use antibiotics to treat almost all cases of bacterial infection. So an antibiotic is a drug that kills or slows the growth of bacteria. The prefix anti means against, bio means life. So it goes against life. It's killing these things inside you. Antibiotics kill bacteria by attacking the cell wall and poking holes in it. So they keep the cell wall from forming on new bacteria, and they poke holes in existing cell walls. So you can think of it kind of like a gusher if you were to squeeze it and the stuff just pops out. And if the DNA is not protected, then the bacteria can't reproduce. The first antibiotic ever made was penicillin. And we read a story on that, but it was a very long time ago. So if you want to talk about it in office hours, it's a very interesting origin story. Penicillin stops the creation of bacterial cell walls. That's what this word right here means, inhibits. It's just a fancy word for stops. So they can't build new cell walls, and that keeps them from reproducing. The one thing to make note of is that bacteria reproduce super quickly. And because of this, they have a high rate of mutation. So we are now seeing, and we have seen over time, many bacteria that form resistance to specific antibiotics. The goal of the medical community is to continue to produce antibiotics at a rate that keeps up with the mutation rate of bacteria, so we can introduce a new one if certain bacteria become resistant to pre-existing ones. And now we're going to talk about bacterial identification. So to classify bacteria, we actually do it based on the structure of their cell wall through a process called gram staining. So if we encounter a bacterium, we can differentiate between types of bacteria, like one bacteria and another, using this gram staining process. So there are two types, gram positive and gram negative, along with the three shapes that we talked about before. And knowing whether they're gram positive or negative and the shapes that they have can help us classify the bacteria that we are looking at. So we're going to talk briefly about different disorders that are caused by bacteria. The first is Clostridium tetani. You can see this guy right here. This one causes tetanus or lockjaw. Symptoms would be spasms, muscle stiffness, and difficulty swallowing. And it's spread through manure and soil or anything rusty. So if you've ever stepped on like a rusty nail, you've probably had to go get a tetanus booster. You should get that booster or shot every 10 years. Next up, we have salmonella. I think all of us have probably heard of this in the news or just from like talking to family, but it causes food poisoning. Symptoms are severe diarrhea, fever, vomiting, and it's spread by eating or drinking contaminated food or water. So the most common cause would be like raw chickens or eggs, but you can also get it if you have a pet turtle and it's infected, or from baby chickens if you live on a farm. Next up, we have Bacillus anthracis. You can see in the name here that it's what causes anthrax, which created a huge scare when someone was mailing that in the postal system years ago. Symptoms are severe breathing problems, vomiting of blood, and intense abdominal pain. And it can be spread through a cut, through inhaling the spores, or through contaminated meat. So that's why it's super important that you always cook your meat super well. And then we have Treponema pallidum. We already talked about treponema. You can see the little spirilla down here. It causes syphilis, which is a sexually transmitted infection. And symptoms would be sores, skin rash, fever, heart problems. It's spread through direct sexual contact. And if it's untreated, it can be fatal, but it's easy to fix if it's caught early. So if you are sexually active, make sure that you are getting tested every 3 to 6 months in order to make sure that you catch these types of things early if you get them. That is the end of our notes. So now your only job is to go complete your exit ticket. Remember, do it without your notes. It lets us know what you learned and what we need to review. And if you have any questions, as always, pop into office hours or leave a comment in the room. Thank you, guys.